Good morning. Welcome to episode 1 of a brand new podcast called Best Damn Reality. My name is Noune, and I'm going to be your host for the next 60 minutes. This podcast is being launched very purposely on July 4th, 2020. I'm coming at you from Sarasota, Florida, here in the United States. And for us here in the US of A, this is a holiday, Independence Day, that is celebrated. And it just so happens that a huge part of what I'm intending to be an example of is really allowing ourselves to experience unprecedented personal freedom. Unprecedented in the sense of no longer being restricted, constricted, bounded, held back by what I perceive to be a lot of archaic aspects of our society. You might hear me generally reference things as mainstream world versus evolving world. And I don't like categorizing things. I try to refrain from oversimplifying with labels and categorizations. However, we know that as human beings, we have those to help us sift through and understand and comprehend and process all the massive amounts of information that bombard us at any given time. I will do my best from, trying to delineate between any sort of categories. But the reality is that our mainstream world, what we all are continuing to experience in mass, is not an accurate representation of the greater reality, the all that is, the truth with the capital T, universal truths, sort of like how gravity is a universal fact of the third dimension Earth. You can't go ahead, try not to believe in it, but go jump off a building and I'm pretty sure you're not going to fly. There are universal truths out there. And our species is at this magical time of having an opportunity to consciously evolve. It is to those folks that this show is primarily directed. It's coming at you talking about things from a yes, still using some of the same words, but I will always point out the fact that words are simply not going to cut trying to describe these greater truths and what I mean about working to come together to create our best reality and not settle for the collective that we see in mass on our planet at present. Given that it's episode 1, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, basically just the most relevant pieces for you to know, as I think you'll get to know me if you choose to keep tuning in each Saturday. If you found me on iTunes or Spotify, you may have noticed that, or found me by doing a search under spirituality, which is the overlying theme that my show will be listed under. While I very much anticipate and eagerly await being able to talk from a much higher perspective, a truly out of this planet perspective of reality and how it's constructed, to begin with, I'm just going to talk about the absolute fundamental basics. I'm going to share stories from my own life that sort of demonstrate this conscious creation of our own reality. And it's all serving a much bigger project for these first 3 months. And after the first 12 episodes, I'm going to reevaluate and see where we're going to take the podcast next. Now, I've said that this is a participatory podcast. This is a co-creation. To begin with, it'll be subtle, what we create, because obviously we're not in physical presence of one another. We're only listening and exchanging words. But words are incredibly powerful. And words are just the outward expression of thoughts and beliefs. And really, all a belief is a practiced thought. Something you've had over and over and over again then becomes a belief. And one of the most challenging parts of these times is recognizing if you're on a conscious spiritual journey, you begin to live your life with much greater attention and purpose, and you recognize all the crazy layers of beliefs that we have buried within us. And I would argue most of those are at a subconscious level, meaning we didn't necessarily have the awareness when we were building these thought patterns within us. We have all been brought up in a society and a culture where the momentum was already very much in place by the time any of us listening to this right now were born, including the oldest of my listeners. We've had these sort of conditioning programs within our school system, within the systems of operation that our society relies upon, very much in our media. We've been conditioned to a very limited perspective of what reality is. And we've been made to believe that all there is only what you can sense with one of your five senses. And the greater truth is, there couldn't be anything more inaccurate than that. There are reality, the greater reality, there is a far, far more in the unseen world that we cannot point to, that we cannot sense with one of our five senses going on. And at these times on our planet right now, that unseen world is very much affecting every human being, every living thing on the planet. And it would really, really make a lot of sense for, at a minimum, for people to open their mind up to this fact. They don't need to necessarily agree that that resonates for truth for themselves, because there's plenty of human beings for whom the current systems and the current paradigm, they're doing pretty well within those. And I never intend to rain on anybody else's parade. It's not about that. This is about trying to broaden definitions, lose definitions and labels and titles, remove hierarchies, go higher in the tree to include more in what you see and what you're experiencing. In this hour with me, my ultimate goal is to have our minds and our hearts be as wide open as possible. Yes, I'm going to come at you with stories that are directly from my life. But almost 8 years ago now, on August 9th, it will be the 8-year anniversary of when I completely surrendered my life in sort of, I call it an experiment of energy. When I really took a newfound spiritual awakening that I personally had experienced about 2 years prior, and as such really began to completely restructure my life. And the ultimate goal was always to be able to have complete control over how I was engaging in the world. I no longer wanted to be controlled by having to play by the rules within these systems that I never found success in, that I found to be unbelievably limiting to my greater essence. I was very unhappy for most of my adulthood until my awakening. And I was, even though I have tremendous skill sets and gifts and college degrees and all the tools I would need to go out into the world and get, that job to pay bills, that didn't move my soul. My soul hasn't been moved by most types of work for the majority of my life. And I believe work is simply going out into the world and meeting a need. Right now, I think from my perspective, one of the greatest needs for humanity are more voices speaking to these powerfully shifting times. But perhaps even more importantly than coming at you with more words and just bombarding you with more information at a time when we've never been more inundated by information, I want to make my words practical in your life. That's one of the goals, is to begin to go higher in the tree, if you will. Open your minds and hearts back up to the infinite possibilities that exist. Believe that we can begin to come together as individual humans from a very different perspective of love versus a fear-based world that we're all still playing around in, and really recreating reality. And there are a lot of different ways from which I can come and discuss this. Many different angles from which I can come. Many different perspectives. Multitudes of metaphors. I can use the metaphor of music and say we're the conductors of our own orchestras. I can come at you from a film metaphor and say that we are the director, producer, and stars of our own movies. I can come and talk about sports and say that there's a new game out in the world being played, the energy game versus the money game. I'm going to probably go back and forth through a lot of different metaphors. Sports is one of my favorites because I come from an athletic background. I played college basketball for only a short period of time, and that's a whole story in and of itself, was the miracle of how a 4'11", 3/4, just under 5 feet, female basketball player in the mid-90s somehow attracted a full athletic scholarship to a Division I school. When I had my personal awakening and I looked back and did the life review of my own life, which sort of I feel naturally happens when you have your awakening, because you look back and you recognize that everything happened for a reason and that a much greater energy is guiding things than our limited human personalities. And those of us that have had experience as type A control freaks, that's a big adjustment to surrender. And it was made easy for me after my awakening because the examples in my life were so crystal clear when I began to look back. And one of the biggest ones early on was the fact that I drew in to my reality an opportunity for a full athletic scholarship that allowed me to leave the state of Michigan and the city and suburbs of Detroit, where I was born and where I spent my first 18 years. I had a very intense teenage period, as I think many of us do. That is when I would say my light went dark. I was an extremely bright light through about 8th grade for sure and into 9th grade. And then a pretty monumental shift in my home took place in 10th grade, and that caused my very bright light to go dark almost immediately. And from that point on, right up until my spiritual awakening, while I had some glimpses of the light, for the most part, I spent 2 decades in the dark, lost, seeking, because I knew, I could feel that the greater truth, that what I saw out in the world and what was portrayed to me as all there is, and okay, congratulations, you made it through college, welcome to reality. Now you will spend the rest of your life working your ass off, probably doing something you don't really enjoy, and by the time you retire, maybe then you get to enjoy your life if you're still alive, and if you've, managed to not go completely insane with denying who you are and what you really want to do for that period of time. I was on the fast track of probably not surviving because the depths of my depression and my sadness and my frustration and my loneliness had grown so deep by my early 30s. All of society's standards of success were not something that were on my list of accomplishments. I was not able to find a career that called me where I could stay in one place for more than a couple of years. I had been married, but really had no business getting married. So despite being with that man for almost 9 years, our marriage ended after only 3 years. And that's actually when the real work began. And I had to admit to myself that I was sort of taking the easy way out, or at least I thought, by getting married, right? And just kind of attach myself with someone else and let me not do all the individual work, even though there was a pretty high level of awareness that I was not, I didn't have my shit together. I really, really had no business committing my life to another person when I had no clue how I was fitting in to the world post-college graduation. So I didn't have a family, got divorced, and, haven't been remarried since. I don't have children. Only recently did I become a homeowner for the first time. And about 4.5 years ago, I became a pet owner for the first time. And I have 2 little cats that fell into my life that have altered my life dramatically. So a lot has happened in my adulthood, a lot of personal transition. And after what I call my spiritual awakening, I have a date called the point of no return that I refer to it as. November 18th, 2010 was my point of no return, where I just had blown through in the terms of my awareness, and I knew now that I was never going to go back to the mainstream world and try to fit into that game that clearly I was not intended to fit into. After a year at Microsoft and a magical 14 months living in Seattle, Washington, my journey brought me back to Florida despite never planning to return here. And I have been here ever since. And actually in the same home. The home I now own began with me renting it at the end of January in 2013, just a few weeks after launching my company of me. My company of me is just my name, Allison Irene Noune, LLC, and my tagline is, it's all about the energy. And ever since that time, I have been on a mission to make my reality personally the absolute best I could imagine, literally. I wanted to be doing the work of my dreams, which was to interact out in the world, not doing the same thing over and over again for the same employer for my entire life, but instead to try to match my skill sets and my interests with different opportunities at different times. I launched my company with a huge pay-it-forward investment in others, for I believe that one of the many things we have an opportunity to do in these magical times is to redefine pretty much everything, namely how we do work and how we invest in one another and how we handle money in our financial system and how that directly affects our economic system. And as I referenced earlier, what we're all out there doing in terms of work. And my belief is that given that I know we are all connected, it makes sense to me that everybody has the greatest opportunity possible to do work out in the world that moves their soul, that they love. Having people engaged every day for as often as possible in activities that make their heart sing helps all of us. And I am, in my company of me, among other things, I'm about creating those opportunities. First and foremost, for myself, but quickly then extrapolating that out to my vast network. Best damn reality is a matter of understanding that each of us individually essentially is in our own world. We are all kind of the captains of our own ship, as I said earlier, another metaphor there. And when we go out and mix and mingle with other human beings, we're playing and entering their worlds. And then collectively, we've got this mass Earth planet reality. And it's really a tricky thing because it's all about focus and perspective. To what you're giving your focus and your attention is what gets fed and then continues to be the physical manifestation of reality. It also comes down to agreements. What are we agreeing to in terms of, why are so many people still agreeing to a standard 40-hour work week if that doesn't really make sense to the greater number of human beings anymore? I would argue it's because we've lost a little bit of our creative and our creative abilities and our sense of imagination. But just like everything of today has been co-created and agreed upon by humans, all the humans coming before us, and to whatever degree humans today are agreeing to see things in a certain way, we have the opportunity to come together again to co-create very different ideas of reality. We have an opportunity to come together to co-create all of the systems upon which we've grown dependent. And it begins with understanding that it's going to require us to have a tremendous amount of ability to be individually responsible for our own lives. You've got to come out of the victim consciousness. You've got to come out of the desire to put the blame somewhere outside of us. We've got to come out of this fighting exchange momentum. We've got to come out of the fear momentum. And we mostly need to rise above the competition and belief in lack of resources and begin to understand that there is a great abundance, that there is plenty on this planet for everybody to be living a thriving life, if only we are able to come together to redefine some of the ways that the resources of the planet are distributed. I want to, there are infinite numbers of ways that this is likely not going to be the real episode 1. This is the third practice recording that I have done with the intention of capturing episode 1 that will go live on July 4th. But the reality is that I'm not quite yet ready to do this live and in the moment. Therefore, I need to have it pre-recorded. In this first episode, I'm attempting to capture some really high-level generalizations of a lot of things. And given that words are so limited in being able to describe any of it, and given that there are so many perspectives and ways that I can even attempt to describe what I'm trying to do, it makes it even more complicated to succinctly give the listener a decent idea of what the heck this podcast is going to be about. Let me segue a little bit into how the first 3 months in particular are going to be structured. This, as I mentioned before, is a small piece of a much larger project. The much larger project is called Ripple 2020. In short, it's going to be a massive fundraising effort. $4 million I intend to raise with Ripple 2020 to then be redistributed out after taxes, which then leaves approximately $2.5 million, to a predetermined group of beneficiaries that is still in motion in terms of being decided upon. This begins to tap into the co-creative part of, okay,